This is joint work with my now graduated student, Tyrus Fisher. And I promise to keep this highly non-technical. I just put the technicalia on so in case any of you are willing to work through some lambda formulas. Also, I should say it's an honor to be here with Stephen Neal. Stephen was a professor of mine back in grad school. He wasn't on my committee, but he did show up. Like whenever I needed help, he was magically there and always gave me sage advice. And his work, especially his book descriptions, which is one of the first things I read, was inspiration to my work. So it's a real honor to be here with him. Okay, so can I use the board? Is it okay to? I'm interested in this work on Sobel sequences because I think it speaks to a greater fight in the philosophy language that's been raging for the last while over what sort of things you should think of in effect as being controlled by Gricean mechanisms, and what sort of things you should think are being controlled by highly conventionalized mechanisms. There's lots of ways that this fight proceeds. Thank you. But I think Sobel sequences has been one of the cases that are kind of nice to look at because the intuitions are delicate and the considerations are kind of delicate. So I want to go through some of those. I figured this is one of the hearts of sort of Gricean territory and thought, so I should come and say a few words about that. And it's also, there's a kind of puzzle that I'm not going to resolve here, but I do find puzzling, which is the debate that I'm going to enter into here looks like it could be solved just by consulting intuitions about truth values. This isn't the only sort of debate that's like that, but I've always found it really puzzling that you can't just solve it that way. And so I'll leave you kind of with an open question I'd love your help with, which is, why not? It's about, in effect, about subjunctive conditionals and modals. And so you think, well, those are paradigm cases where our intentions sort of help fix what the context is like. So it should be really easy in a way to locate how to solve debates like this, and yet it seems not to be. And so at the end, I'll re-ask the question, and any advice you have would be most appreciated. Okay, so what is the puzzle? Well, first, to get our target right, the puzzle concerns conditionals, and in particular, subjunctive conditionals. And a subjunctive conditional is distinguished from, word escapes me. Indicative conditional, thank you, by the subjunctive morphology typically. So if P were the case, Q would be, versus if P then Q without the subjunctive morphology. Often illustrated by this famous case involving John F. Kennedy. So if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, somebody else did. Seems obviously true, but if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, somebody else would have. Highly debatable. Standard idea is indicative conditionals usually limit you to something like a set of worlds that are candidates for being the actual world, whereas this allows us, to say P were the case, to think of sets of worlds or possibilities that go beyond what we know to be the case. So assuming we know, which is highly debatable, that Oswald killed Kennedy, when I say if Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, somebody else would have, the thought goes, forget what you think you know about Oswald killing Kennedy, focus on what would have happened if he hadn't. So that's the rough distinction that people have tried to cut between the two. And there's a going conservative theory about how to make sense of these, due to Lewis and to Stalnaker, which goes something like the following. Take your world, and then think of there being a metric on worlds, of how close they are to yours. And closeness here is judged by similarity, by how similar they are to yours. How to make sense of similarity is this very fraught, difficult issue, but the idea is something like, if I were to drop this marker, it would fall. Worlds where it falls are more similar to ones where a world just kind of changes to a bird and flies away, or where it levitates in the middle of air for no apparent reason, or where I disappear and somebody else catches it. All these sort of fantastical possibilities are thought to be farther, and you use your intuitions to guide you in a sense of what's more similar and what's less similar. And then the thought goes in context. Sometimes we specify what dimension of similarity we're interested in. So if I say, if Caesar had led the North in the American Civil War, he would use the following tactics. He would use the guns better. And the thought goes, well, in one sense, Caesar was this great general, so he probably would have. On the other hand, Caesar knew nothing about guns, so if all of a sudden he was at the head of the American forces in the Civil War, he would have no idea what he was doing. So you think, well, okay, we can specify what similarity about Caesar all of a sudden appearing and being the head of some forces would be like. Fortunately for us, we don't have to worry about any of that. But the idea is something like you have these spheres of similarity, and when I say if P were the case, think of the world that's closest to ours, or the set of worlds at which P is true, and then see there if Q is true as well. So if I say if I were to drop this marker, it would fall. Locate the nearest set of worlds where I drop the marker, and then see if at those worlds it falls. Ones where it flies upwards, those are possibilities presumably, but they're not very similar to ours, so you locate them further away. And so the idea is, if I say if P were the case, Q would be the case. Look for the set of worlds that's closest, and then see if they're all Q worlds. Conversely, if I say if I flip a coin, it would turn up heads. I would say object to that because you think, well, half the possibilities look like they're tail possibilities, right? Half the possibilities look like head possibilities. So if I say if I were to flip a coin, it would come up on one side. The idea is, look at the worlds where I flip a coin. Not all of them are ones where it comes up heads. Half of them, presumably, if it's a fair coin, are ones where it comes up tails. So you'd object that it's not true. So far, so good? Okay. And so this leads to some predictions, and we'll start off with the classic one on the back. So the sample sentence on the back of the last page. So imagine there's a parade, and Pedro's in the parade, and he's highly visible. Pedro Martinez, this baseball hero, and I say if Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. So you think, okay, using this machinery, think of possibilities like ours. Assume Sophie didn't go to the parade. I say if she had gone to the parade, she'd see Pedro. Well, since Pedro's so easy to see, at all the sort of normal worlds we can think of near ours, where Sophie goes to the parade, she sees Pedro because he's easy to see and she'd be there. And she can see fine, et cetera, right? Of course, there's possibilities where Sophie loses her eyesight the moment she gets to the parade. There's possibilities where Pedro just disappears and becomes invisible, but those are presumably farther out and not ones that we're thinking of when we think of what would happen if Sophie had gone to the parade. So far, so good? Okay. And then I say, well, what if Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind someone really tall, right? So imagine here's Sophie, and then there's like these tall people right in front of her. Here's Pedro. You think, well, if she'd gone to the parade and been stuck behind someone tall, she wouldn't see Pedro, right? So far, so good. The nearest worlds, presumably where she goes to the parades, are ones where she's not stuck behind someone tall, because even if there's a tall person, she can move around. But there is a possibility where she gets stuck behind someone tall, so you have to go a bit further out. And at those worlds, where she's stuck behind someone tall, she can't move, she doesn't get to see Pedro. So far, so good, right? So in other words, strengthening the antecedent, adding a conjunct to the antecedent of the first doesn't preserve truth. From if Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. It doesn't follow that if Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind a tall person, she would have seen Pedro, right? Because she wouldn't have if she was stuck behind someone really tall. So that makes sense, right? The first one's true, because we think of these worlds where she goes and it's all normal, she doesn't get stuck. And then there's worlds where she gets stuck, and those ones she doesn't get to see Pedro. So if that's the right assignment of truth values, we should be able to reverse them. And so this is the classic RSS on the back. Imagine Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind a tall person. She wouldn't have seen Pedro. We agree that's true, so far so good. The puzzling one is number 2. If Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. And intuition revolts against assigning that one true now. And there's a kind of natural reason why. You think, well, what if she'd been stuck behind someone tall, right? If she'd been stuck behind someone tall, she wouldn't have seen Pedro. And so switching the order seems to not preserve same truth value. Surprising result, given that all you've done is instead of going to the near ones where she goes to the parade where she'd see Pedro, and then going to further away ones where she gets stuck behind someone tall, reversing that order presumably doesn't reverse how similar the worlds are. And so, bad prediction for Louis Stallnaker that if she'd gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. In other words, reversing these should make a difference. Reversing them does make a difference. Question for intuition, why? Well, a natural thing to say is, it's just not true if she'd gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. And so we have a sort of choice point here. Number one, once you reverse them, the first one of the classic one, the if Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro, just isn't true. So first option, it's false, that if Sophie had gone, she'd see Pedro. Or, in effect, unassertable. There's something wrong with asserting number two once you've asserted, with asserting if Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro, after asserting if she had gone to the parade and been stuck behind a tall person, she would have seen Pedro. And so you have this sort of classic kind of Grice versus conventionalist choice point here. What should you make of the status of number two, the little hashtag I put beside it? We know there's something wrong with asserting two, and a natural explanation of why it's not okay to assert it is because it's false. Another natural explanation of why it's not okay to assert it is because it's true, but something blocks you from being able to assert it. And we're very familiar with things that can make sentences that are otherwise true unassertable. So these are all these classic cases you can get from the Graysian literature, from Grice himself. If you ask me if there's a gas station nearby, and I know there's one nearby, but it's closed, and you're desperate for gas, and I say there's a gas station nearby around the left, there's something wrong with that assertion, not because it's false, because there is a gas station there, but because I'm going to mislead you given your goals. And so we're very familiar with this idea that true things can be unassertable. That's not a surprising category. And so the question is, when you're trying to give us semantics for counterfactuals, should you now have standard semantics like the one I just quickly sketched, plus something to tell you why number two is no longer assertable in the classic RSS? Or should you think that something's changed and so it's now actually false? Should you build in some mechanism that gives you a change of truth value between 1 and 2? So that's, I know this looks like we're looking at trees and not the forest. I'm hoping by the end you'll see why it's worth looking at trees and not forests sometimes, and I'm hoping we can draw out some lessons for the forest. But that's in effect the debate as it stands. So we can look at the sort of two options in turn. Option one, unassertable. Reversing the options. And here's an idea due to Sarah Moss, and this is encoded in EI on the first page of your handout. It's epistemically irresponsible to utter sentence S in context C if there is some proposition phi and possibility mu such that when speaker utters S, S expresses phi and C, it's incompatible with U, U is a salient possibility, and the speaker cannot rule out mu. So what's the thought? I, in the first Sobel sequence, say if Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. I say if Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind a tall person, she wouldn't have seen Pedro. Everything's fine. When I reverse those, and I say if Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind a tall person, I bring to salience, I make it like something now in focus, this world where Sophie goes to the parade and gets stuck behind someone tall. So I've expressed something with that possibility. This is incompatible with her seeing Pedro, her going to the parade and being stuck behind someone tall. I've made it salient, so the third condition is that salient, and I made it salient by bringing up that possibility in the antecedent of the conditional. And I've made it and if I ask you, are you absolutely sure that if she went to the parade, she wouldn't get stuck behind someone tall? If you don't have evidence that's going to rule that out, then you can't rule that out. And since you can't rule it out, the idea is saying that if she'd gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro just ignores something that's been made salient, and it's not assertable. It's bad conversing with other people to utter, if Sophie had gone to the parade, she'd seen Pedro, given that we're paying attention to this possibility now. So the idea is you have this sort of Gricean mechanism for undermining the assertability of the otherwise good conditional once you've mentioned the more complex one. The more complex one makes a possibility salient that you're not in a position to rule out, and since you're not in a position to rule it out, you're not in a position to say with adequate evidence that she'd gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. Since not saying something that you have adequate evidence for is like a key thing that makes something unassertable, it's no longer assertable to say if Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. So you have this sort of nice explanation of why you can retain the truth of 2 in the classic RSS, the reverse Sobel sequence, and yet not be able to assert it felicitously because it violates what looks like a Gricean-inspired principle like EI. And then there's a kind of parallel to this in the knowledge literature. So I say, do you know where you are? And you say something like, I'm in San Sebastian. I say, well, what if you were in Barcelona and fell asleep, had this vivid dream about being at a workshop in San Sebastian? Where would you think you were? You'd say, oh, well, I think I was in San Sebastian. I say, well, where would you actually be? You say, Barcelona. I say, well, can you rule out now definitively that you're not asleep in Barcelona dreaming you're in San Sebastian? You think, no. And you think, well, then there's something kind of funny to a skeptic of saying, but I still know that I'm in San Sebastian. Why? Well, something similar to this is going to predict exactly that. I've made this possibility that you're sleeping in Barcelona salient. Once it's salient, if you can't rule it out, you can't then go ahead and assert things that are in tension with something that's been made salient, but that can't be ruled out. So far, so good? On the same page? So you have this rule that's inspired by cooperation, in effect, and there's a thought that cooperation requires us not to go around saying things that are in contrast to things that are important to us right now or salient that we're paying attention to that we don't have evidence at this point to rule out. So that's good, because you predict now that there'll be something wrong with 2. And that something wrong with 2 preserves the idea that it's true, and yet falls on the sort of side of saying that there's a gas station nearby when the person's looking for gas and you know the gas station's actually closed. So that's option unassertability. But there's a second option, which you might think looks pretty good as well. Why can't you say 2? Well, a natural reason to think there's something wrong or infelicitous about 2 is that's not true. How can we make it that 2 is not true, given it's the very same sentence as 1 in the sequence beforehand, and we admitted that 1 was true in the sequence beforehand? Well, here's a thought due to von Fintel and pursued by Tony Gillies. And the idea is something like this. We should complicate the semantics of subjunctive conditionals in the following way. Beef up the notion of a context of, and in effect, I'm going to do what Stephen tells you not to do. I'm going to treat the context as a kind of reified object, but it's encoding something like information that we're sharing, which I take it is a sort of acceptable notion. Beef up the notion of information we're sharing with what he calls a modal horizon. And a modal horizon is like a set of worlds that we're paying attention to. So the idea is, realistically, we always have some sort of modal horizon that we're sharing, because we all agree not just about things that we share in common about the actual world, but also about what could happen. So I presume we all think there's a lot of possibilities that aren't happening but could, and we share views about that. But let's pretend, just to make it easy, that the modal horizon is empty, right? We haven't started speaking, and we know nothing about what we share by way of open possibilities. And then the thought goes, when I say, if P were the case, for any P, then Q would be the case. So don't worry about these fancy formulae. They're just there in case you're really good at reading those and want to. But if you're not, no worries. If I say P were the case, then Q would be the case. Right now, we're not tracking any possibilities at all, right? In order to accommodate, to let us discuss the thing that I just said, open up this by adding into it a bunch of worlds, all P worlds. In effect, we're going to mimic what Lewis is up to, add in all the nearby reasonable P worlds that you can think of, and then see if at all those Q would be the case. And then the thought goes, this modal horizon sticks around. It doesn't go away once I've finished uttering. It's a part of the context in the sense that we keep on tracking the possibilities that we're treating as ones to pay attention to. So far, so good? Okay, well, the idea then is this sticks around and it's kind of stingy. It doesn't like, I'm going to speak metaphorically here, obviously. It doesn't like to get bigger unless it has to. You don't include more worlds unless you really have to include more worlds. So far, so good? So if you have to include more worlds, you do. But if you don't, you don't. So if I say if P were the case, Q would be the case. If I say if P were the case, R would be the case. Well, I already have the P worlds, so I don't have to expand it for more P worlds because I already have them around. So I don't have to do anything to the modal horizon now. And if P entails S, and I say if S were, then Z would be, I don't have to expand because if P entails S, I already have all the S worlds here anyways. So the idea is you don't go around paying attention to more worlds than you have to. We, in conversation, sort of keep this set fixed. It doesn't go away. It doesn't shrink all of a sudden unless we do something funny, like say, forget everything we've talked about, start from 0. But it also doesn't get bigger unless it has to. So when you look at the Sobel sequence, sorry, I know there's a lot of going back and forth. I say if Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. I add into this empty horizon a bunch of Sophie going to the parade worlds, all the kind of reasonable nearby ones. And then I look to see if they're all ones in which she sees Pedro. And it looks like it is, right? That's the whole intuition we started with. And then I say, but if Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind a tall person, she wouldn't have seen Pedro. Now I look here in the modal horizon, and I see, are there any worlds there at which Sophie goes to the parade and gets stuck behind someone tall? Now, by hypothesis, they weren't there yet, right? Because you agreed that she'd gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro. So we agreed that all the normal ones where she goes are not ones where she's just stuck behind someone tall and can't get around them. So now, in order for you to make sense of me saying, but Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind a tall person, we have to add in the parade plus tall people world. So it gets bigger, right? There's worlds in it that now, after I've asserted if Sophie had gone to the parade and stuck behind a tall person, she wouldn't have seen Pedro, that weren't there before. They're all the, she goes to the parade plus tall people worlds. And then you think, okay, well, now consider the set of worlds where she goes to the parade and she gets stuck behind someone tall. Not all of those are ones where she sees Pedro, so it's false that if she'd gone to the parade and stuck behind a tall person, she would have seen Pedro. So number 2 here is true. Reverse the ordering, however, and you get a different effect. So reverse the ordering. Start off with an empty modal horizon, nothing in it. And say, now the classic RSS, if Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind a tall person, she wouldn't have seen Pedro. To fill up the modal horizon now, we have to add in parade plus tall person, right? So we have a bunch of worlds where she goes to the parade and gets stuck behind someone tall. And at those worlds, she doesn't see Pedro, or at least not all those worlds. Yeah?
I mean, you have to be able to shrink it as well, like, so to take out the ones where she's got her stilts with her.
The thought goes, the stilts worlds are farther out than ones where she gets stuck behind the tall person, right? So it doesn't shrink, it just doesn't expand to include those. Start off with 0, and then add in all the reasonable worlds where she both goes to the parade and is stuck behind someone tall. That's the idea here. Well, not all of those rules she sees Pedro, so number 1 is right, because it says if she'd gone to the parade and stuck, she wouldn't have seen Pedro. Now try asserting 2. If Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro, right? So parade, Pedro. And here's the key move. Look in here and see, do you already have worlds where Sophie goes to the parade? And the idea is, well, yeah, you do. So you don't have to make this grow at all in order to accommodate Sophie going to the parade at number 2 here. So, since we already have parade worlds, look at those and see if at all those she sees Pedro. And the answer is no, because these are worlds where she goes to the parade and gets stuck behind someone tall. At those ones she doesn't see Pedro. So literally number 2 now is false, because the set of worlds that you're paying attention to doesn't have to grow, right? It can stay the same. It already has a witness world for Sophie gone to the parade, she would have seen for Sophie gone to the parade. And at those worlds, not all of them are ones at which she sees Pedro. In fact, even if she had some stilts, as long as there's worlds where she doesn't have stilts, she still won't see Pedro at all of them, right? Because at the non-stilt world, she's stuck behind someone tall. Okay, now, there's a way in which these should both, like if you blink, they look the same, right? In the one case, what you're saying is, well, look, it's not assertable. It's true, but it's not assertable because you brought something up that we can't ignore, and not being able to ignore it means that it's not something you can assert, something in conflict with it if you can't rule it out. The other one said, look, we're tracking worlds. We've added in some worlds at which he goes to the parade and gets stuck behind someone tall. You can't ignore those because that's what we're paying attention to, so it's just not true. And you think, well, those are pretty similar. And here's a kind of puzzle, kind of meta puzzle. We shouldn't, you'd think, be able just to solve this by thinking about like what we're trying to assert. Like, what are you trying to get across by number 2? Whatever it is, just tell me what it is, and then we could decide. Is it something that's true or something that's unassertable? And what's kind of interesting about this is that you can't. if we could resolve this debate really, really easily, right? I could just ask you, think about number 2. False or true but unassertable. You know, you guys know the language. Translate it into Spanish or Basque as you like and do it, and then you'll be. But we're not able to. And so that's kind of puzzling. And moreover, and this is what I kind of like about the philosophy language, when you start thinking about the differences between these two, you start getting these kind of fine-grained distinctions that I think are worth paying attention to and that can help resolve this debate. So where direct intuition can't, at least on the face of it, there's some differences between the predictions that maybe can. So I'm going to go through a couple of those. And the sort of way this is heading is they're going to look good at first for the false view, and then I'm going to try to undermine them and think, actually, they look terrible for the false view, and that's surprising. Okay, so what are the claimed advantages? Well, here's the first. Remember I said that if Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind someone tall, she would have seen Pedro. And I said that makes Sophie going to worlds in which she gets stuck behind someone tall salient. But you might think, well, why does putting something in an antecedent of conditional make something salient, right? What is it about antecedents of conditionals, unasserted context, that's supposed to actually do all the relevant work that Moss's principle is doing? And so this is something that actually falls right out of the false the view on which is false, do von Fintel and Gillies, not the false von Fintel view. And that's if to might. So if to might is on your handout. It's from phi and psi, then chi, right? That if phi, possibly psi. So this is called if to might. And what it says is, if phi and psi were the case, then chi would be the case. Then if phi were the case, psi might have been the case. So if I say, for instance, if I go to San Sebastian and have some pinchos, sorry, this should be an and. If I go to San Sebastian and have some pinchos, I'll be very happy. This entails, if I go to San Sebastian, I might have some pinchos. Take the conjunction here and assert it as a possibility given phi. So far,
That's fine, right?
yeah, sorry. Thanks. So far, so good. Well, this is going to fall right out of the von Fintel account, but not out of Moss's account. Why is that? Well, remember we had the modal horizon. And remember, that's a fancy name for worlds or possibilities that we're paying attention to. So if I say if Sophie had gone to the parade and been stuck behind a tall person, so parade plus tall, then she would have been stuck, then she wouldn't have seen Pedro. To evaluate that in the first place, I had to have worlds in the modal horizon where she goes to the parade and she's stuck behind someone tall. So if I say if she'd gone to the parade, she might have been stuck behind someone tall, that's automatically guaranteed just by having done the relevant adjustments to accommodate if she had gone to the parade and been stuck behind someone tall. So in other words, by mentioning if she'd gone to the parade and been stuck behind someone tall, she wouldn't have seen Pedro, you, as a good conversant with me, add in a bunch of worlds in which she goes to the parade and she's stuck behind someone tall. So those worlds are there. So if I say, well, if she'd gone to the parade, is it possible she'd be stuck behind someone tall? Well, look and see. Yeah, in every one of these, where she goes to the parade, she's stuck behind someone tall. So it's definitely possible that if she'd gone to the parade, she would have been stuck behind someone tall. So the mechanics of the view itself underwrite if to might. They guarantee that it's going to work out. Because it's entailed by the very alterations that you have to do to the modal horizon in order to evaluate the counterfactual in the first place. So what that tells you then is, of course, you're going to have something that's incompatible with the modal horizon because, of course you're going to be guaranteed that possibility by the operations of the modal horizon in a way that is guaranteed now just by the function of the semantics. And there's nothing similar for Moss's view to do. There's no similar guarantee other than by asserting directly that if you mention something in antecedent, it thereby becomes salient. So it's nice. You have a prediction, right, that says, I can predict that there'll be possibilities that can't be ignored just by the mechanics of the semantics in a way that there's nothing similar on the other side. So that's an advantage, right? You implement by means of the semantics something that you have to stipulate by means of the pragmatics otherwise. Second claimed advantage, and this one I find really interesting. There's a feature of subjunctive conditionals that makes them interesting and not well explained, which is that you can put in what are known as negative polarity items. A negative polarity item is this really interesting animal where you have terms that sit very well under the scope of negation, but otherwise don't. So for instance, the classic term is anything or anyone. If I tell you I see any people, that's bad, right? I'm hoping that's data point, but I don't see any people is great. Thumbs up for I don't see any people. That's mysterious, right? What is it about any that makes it sit so well under negation, or in these sort of contexts, but doesn't make it sit well without a negation around? And that's a weird thing. Why is this relevant to conditionals? Well, it looks like these actually sit fairly well in the antecedent of a conditional. So if you had seen anything, or seen any people, you would have called them. Any people looks like it's doing quite well in the antecedent of a conditional. Right? And that's weird because there's no negation obviously sitting around here to say like, oh, you can use any because I'm negative, right? In the way that I don't see any people has this negation around saying I am negative, so now you can use any in my scope. So what's going on? Well, there's an old view due to Bill Lagisaw, it's not that old, I guess. And the idea is something like, things like any do really well in what are known as downward entailing contexts. A downward entailing context is one from which, let me illustrate by example. If I say, I didn't see anyone, this licenses all subsets. So I didn't see anyone entails I didn't see anyone with a parasol, and I didn't see anyone with a dog, and I didn't see anyone with a hat, and I didn't see anyone with a car and a hat and a dog and a parasol, right? So the thought goes, well, it'd be nice then if you hadn't seen any people was downward entailing. And von Fintel's view guarantees that it is with one little trick. What's the trick? It's going to be downward entailing as long as the presuppositions are satisfied. So let me walk you through what that is. And here's the basic idea. Take my neighbor regrets that I bought any guitars. So my neighbor regrets that I bought any cars, and this is number D under 6 on the handout. Looks like it entails my neighbor regrets that I bought a Fender. A Fender is a famous brand of guitar. On the assumption that I bought a Fender, right? So on the assumption that I bought a Fender, you can reason from D to E. And the thought goes, you can't regret something that didn't happen. So the presupposition that what you regret is something that happened. So you can't regret that I bought a Fender unless I bought a Fender. So on the assumption that the presuppositions here are fulfilled, my neighbor regrets that I bought any guitars. Take anything that's a guitar that I bought, my neighbor is going to regret that I bought that too. So this is known as Strawson downward entailing. It's due to Strawson, and his idea was something like, if I say everyone is happy, that's going to entail everyone who is F is happy on the assumption that they're Fs. So if I say, for instance, everyone is happy, therefore everyone who went to Venus and had a milkshake is happy, that's going to suffer a presupposition failure because no one went to Venus and had a milkshake. But if I say everyone is happy, on the assumption that there are people in San Sebastian, everyone who's happy is going to entail everyone who's in San Sebastian is happy. So as long as the presuppositions are in place, you're good. So now let's think about von Fintel's case. If Sophie went to the parade, plus tall person, she'd see Pedro. Remember, we're trying to explain why negative polarity items are licensed in antecedents. Well, if Sophie went to the parade and saw Pedro, is now going to, she wouldn't see Pedro, is going to license if Sophie went to parade, wouldn't see Pedro. Why? Because there's at least one world where she goes to the parade that we're paying attention to, namely the one where she gets stuck behind someone tall. So, what does this all amount to? Well, unlike Lewis's view, von Fintel's view can predict that you're going to get downward entailing items, because this looks like it entails this, and so you should expect that words like any are going to be okay in the antecedent of subjunctive conditionals. So I know this is like a highly complex route to defend a semantics, but sometimes this is what you require when you try to think of how two different views that look very similar on the face of it are going to differ. The idea is, as far as the argument goes, von Fintel guarantees that where the presuppositions are satisfied, from P were the case, then Q would be the case. You're going to get P were the case and R were the case, then Q would be the case. Those are exactly environments in which you expect words like any to now be okay, and it looks like words like any are okay in exactly those environments, because I can say, if I had seen anyone, I would have told you. Where anyone looks like it's looking for a downward entailing environment to live in. So these are two claimed advantages for von Fintel, and they're substantial ones, right, on the face of it. On the one hand, he can predict that there will be worlds that are going to satisfy if to might, and then explain why the second conditional and the classic RSS are going to be bad. And two, he can say that his semantics at a greater level of generality explains why you can have words like any feature in the antecedents, which looks like you can. So far, so good. Okay, so what's wrong with all this? It looks like you have victory von Fintel. Victory von Fintel means that when you inspected your intuitions about the second sentence of the classic RSS, you should have come up with false, not with unassertable. Surprising fact. It looks like we have trouble just consulting our intuitions and figuring out if number 2 is false or unassertable, but true. And so we have to retreat to a higher level of theorizing. And this is a higher level of theorizing where you start to notice that maybe there are some advantages to one view over the other. So that's good, right? It's good that we're able to do this. What's wrong with it? All right, so this is the downside of the predictions. So Lewis had fewer predictions, which makes it easier to defend. Von Fintel has predictions that unfortunately we think come out false. And that's what I'm going to try to argue for the, how much time do I have?
10, 15 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll try to argue for the rest of the talk. Thanks. So remember, we had if to might, and that's the principle on page 2 here. So if phi and psi were the case, then chi would be the case. If phi then were the case, then psi might have been the case. Worrisome feature, this looks like it's just not plausible, right? So it looks like it was doing the work of guaranteeing the badness of the second sentence in the reverse Sobel sequence. Actually looks like a principle that isn't true. So here's our first counterexample. This on the back. Hopefully you guys have either read or seen Lord of the Rings, this famous book or trilogy / movie about a little hobbit who goes to destroy a ring that's causing all this trouble in, what's that place called? Whatever that world. Is that? Mordor, thank you. So now imagine we're discussing the awesome power of the wizard Gandalf, and I say, if Sophie had gone to the parade and had her eyes cursed by Gandalf, then she wouldn't have seen Pedro. So far, so good. So you have Sophie going to the parade, plus cursed by Gandalf. Then she doesn't see Pedro because she's not able to see, right? Sounds right. Question for intuition now. Remember, the whole mechanics of the view was that this thing doesn't shrink, the modal horizon. It sticks around, and that's why you can explain the badness of number 2 in the classic RSS. So if I say, so if Sophie had gone to the parade, she might have had her eyes cursed by Gandalf. And I take it that's a crash, right? And it's not hard to see why. We think going to the parade and being cursed by Gandalf is such that it's really far away from what we know about the actual world, right? You have to accommodate a lot, like the existence of wizards, to make it happen. And so you are in a position now to rule out this possibility because you know that when Sophie goes to the parade, she's not going to encounter Gandalf. He's not going to curse her eyes because he doesn't exist. And so you're perfectly happy to accept number 2, which is basically a prediction of Moss's view. When you're in a position to rule out the salient possibility, you're in a position to then assert the counterfactual. The whole point, though, for von Fintel's view, the whole way you encoded the badness of the reverse sequence was to make this thing not shrink. If you let it shrink, then you have no explanation number 2. So in other words, number 2 should come out bad if it doesn't shrink. In order to make number 2 come out good on the modal horizon view, it has to shrink because you have worlds here where she goes to the parade but doesn't have her eyes cursed by Gandalf. And so the inference from if to might just fails, right? It's just not a plausible inference that you want. You don't think that from the fact that I say if she'd gone to the parade and been cursed by Gandalf, she wouldn't see Pedro, that if she'd gone to the parade, she might have been cursed by Gandalf. Why? Because you know that Gandalf isn't going to show up. So that's not good. And moreover, the whole point of this view was to have these stick around so that you can make sense of later on modals that you use, right? That's why you ruled out the RSS. But once you allow this to shrink, you then lose your explanation of sequences like the one on the handout. If Sophie had gone to the parade and had her eyes cursed by Gandalf, then she wouldn't have seen Pedro. How do we know it doesn't shrink now? Because I say, yeah, she would have wandered around terrified and bumping into people. It would have been a disaster. So you think, under what conditions would she have wandered around terrified and bumping into people? Just the ones where she goes to the parade and has her eyes cursed. Similarly, if I say if Sophie had her eyes cursed by Gandalf, but then drank the magical antidote, she would have seen Pedro. So now imagine we increase the number of worlds to allow ones where she gets cursed by Gandalf, but also gets saved by magical antidote. So even more ridiculous than the first ones. I still don't think it's true that if Sophie had her eyes cursed by Gandalf, she wouldn't have seen Pedro. And so you're going to get false predictions all over the place once you impose if to might. So prediction of the one view that the other view can't make turns out to be a bad thing, not a good thing. The prediction actually fails in cases like the ones just mentioned. And these are all cases in which you'd want to have some rescue for this. The rescue for Moss is that you can rule out the relevant salient possibility, but you don't get anything similar for this. Now, of course, you can start to tailor this to say, aha, this is really guided by epistemic considerations. But then, once you've done that, you've basically employed the same Gracian mechanisms that Moss was up to. So the whole point of Moss was to base this on basically the relevant notion of cooperation, where we're thinking of what can you rule out, making something assertable or unassertable. The whole point of this was to semantically encode the workings of the modal horizon. And what you've basically done is done the same thing Moss did. Base it on what we can rule out and not rule out, as opposed to what the semantics tells you is now here and what its later reactions to the worlds here is going to be. Next worry, if you think about it, the whole point of what von Fintel's up to is to give you infelicity of utterance on account of falsity. But you can mimic reverse Sobel sequences in cases where it's not false. So this is revenge sequence 2 on the back. So, sorry, this would be revenge sequence 1. Here's the context. Suppose Sophie goes to the parade in the morning and sees Pedro, but Heidi and Lana don't know this. So Heidi and Lana don't know that she actually did go to the parade and did see Pedro. And Heidi says, if Sophie had gone to the parade this morning and her view was blocked by a tall person, she wouldn't have seen Pedro. That's true, right? Because although she went to the parade and didn't get blocked by someone tall, if she had, she wouldn't have seen Pedro. And Lana answers, but Sophie had gone to the parade this morning, she would have seen Pedro. What Lana's doing is obviously unassertable, but what she says is actually true. Why? Because she said if Sophie had gone to the parade this morning, she would have seen Pedro. Sophie did go to the parade that morning. She did see Pedro. And so while Lana's going to think it's not true, it looks like the relevant things that make number 2 in the reverse Sobel sequence bad was supposed to be falsity, and what Lana's saying is false. Sorry, what Lana's saying is true. And so it looks like the relevant things that are going to make number 2 in the classic RSS good or bad aren't whether it's true or not. What makes it good or bad is basically whether Lana's in a position to rule it out. Lana is not in a position to rule out. It's the best explanation of why what she says comes out to be unassertable, even though true, is because it's unassertable, even though true. All right. One more reason to prefer an account like Moss's over von Fintel's, one that doesn't encode how this thing operates directly without consideration of what the relevant possibilities we can rule in or rule out are, is going to be cases that look like reverse Sobel sequences, seem to behave like reverse Sobel sequences, but in fact aren't as defined reverse Sobel sequences. And so this is revenge sequence 2. So the context is long, I apologize, but here's the idea. Pedro, the person who is under question for being seen the whole time, is in 2 parades, not just 1. He's a busy guy. 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. Sophie, so far as we know, didn't go to either. Okay? So she had to work all day. However, we do know she couldn't have gotten away from her work long enough to attend both parades. She could have gotten away at most to attend 1. So we don't know if she went or not. We know she didn't go to both, and we know that if she went to either, she's more likely to go to the morning one, right? Moreover, Sophie had a noon deadline that would have been quite difficult and stressful to meet where she'd have gotten away from the morning parade. Sorry, she's more likely to go to the afternoon parade than the morning one. So basically, Sophie's working. She's got less to do in the morning, less to do in the afternoon. There's 2 parades. And we don't know if she went to either, but we know she didn't go to both. So far, so good. So I say, if Sophie had gone to the afternoon parade and been stuck behind a tall person, she wouldn't have seen Pedro. So, modal horizon view from von Fintel, you expand this to ones where Sophie goes to the afternoon parade, right? And she gets stuck behind someone tall. No Pedro. So we have worlds now, which she goes to the afternoon parade, she gets stuck behind someone tall, she doesn't see Pedro. And I say, but if Sophie had gone to the morning parade, she would have seen Pedro. So von Fintel's view now has to expand, because while we have afternoon parade worlds, well, we don't have our morning parade worlds. So she should have a morning parade world. The nearest morning parade worlds, of course, are ones where she doesn't get stuck behind someone tall. Because as we thought, when you go to a parade, you usually don't get stuck behind very tall people. Usually you can move. It's a very strange world in which you're just literally stuck behind someone tall. So the morning parade worlds here should be ones where she gets to see Pedro. But there's no way that in the revenge sequence number 2, I can assert if Sophie had gone to the morning parade, she would have seen Pedro. In fact, imagine what you'd say to me if I said that, right? So you say, if she went to the afternoon parade and been stuck behind someone tall, she would have seen Pedro. I say, yeah, but she went to the morning parade, she would have seen Pedro. Now, unless I know something special about tall people at the morning parade, what will you say to me? Say, well, if she got stuck behind someone tall, right? Exactly the same thing you would have said in the classic reverse Sobel sequence number 2. So there's an obvious fix to this. And the obvious fix is, it's not afternoon parade that matters, it's going to parades that matters, and we already have parade worlds, even though they're morning ones in this case and afternoon ones in this case. Answer, yeah, of course that's what's going on. That's because the mechanisms involve salience, not automatic updates to the modal horizon on the basis of the content of the antecedent of a conditional. So, thought goes, what looked like 2 views that were basically encoding the same kind of thing, even though philosophically run off 2 very different motivations, but in effect, encoding the idea that there's worlds that can't be ignored and that ruin either the truth of the second counterfactual or the assertability of it, actually come out to be very different. And they come out to be very different because the one is given to you in the sort of spirit of what's being made salient, and what's being made salient isn't just what the content of an antecedent of a conditional is. What's being made salient is, in effect, what sort of things as a group of conversants we want to talk about, and what sort of things as a group of conversants we think now as being the sort of important topic of conversation. And so that's why if you're slavishly giving account of the horizon that just updates relative to the worlds in the antecedent, you're going to fail to capture sequences that look like ones where the antecedent is slightly different. And you're going to overpredict in cases like the if to might one involving Gandalf and cursing eyes. So surprisingly now, the dialectic is something like this. Two views that look like they're encoding very similar features. One looks like it's encoding features of what I'm making you pay attention to by the antecedent conditional. The other being based on something like, don't violate the Gricean maxim of say things you don't have evidence for that are being made salient. Looks like the first has a striking advantage at first because it can explain negative polarity licensing, like any, and it can guarantee that the antecedents are going to then block the relevant truth of the second member of RSSs, the reverse Sobel sequences. Actual fact looks like the first, the if to might isn't true, and moreover, the mechanisms of salience don't seem to function just by the content of the antecedent of conditionals. Do I have any time left to talk about negative polarity? If not, that's okay, but. Okay, the most complicated one, of course, is the negative polarity items. So you might think, but wait, incorporate into the modal horizon expansion and shrinking whatever you like. Still, what about the negative polarity items? Well, 2 points to make. Number one, once you've incorporated all this, you no longer have this as being downward entailing. So once it can shrink, you no longer have the downward entailments that were supposed to explain it. But two, it looks like it overgenerates. And the overgeneration is a little hard to demonstrate, so I'm going to run you through the examples and we can talk more about them in the question period. So remember the way this is working. We say, if a context, if part of a sentence is downward entailing, if it licenses downward entailing, Strassen downward entailing, so that's downward entailment where the presuppositions are satisfied, then you should expect negative polarity items. So just like I can say, I didn't see anyone, means I didn't see anyone with a dog, entails I didn't see anyone with a good haircut, entails I didn't see anyone with a good haircut and a dog, assuming there are people with dogs and good haircuts and dogs and good haircuts. Given that the key there is that it's downward entailing under the presuppositions being satisfied, looks like von Fintel had a way of explaining why you can use negative polarity items in the antecedent of conditionals. The problem is that it doesn't really look like Strassen downward entailment actually is what licenses negative polarity items. It looks like it overgenerates and I think undergenerates. And so here are the two examples. Take, it was John who saw anyone, right? It was John who saw anyone. And take, only John saw anyone. In effect, it was John who saw anyone and only John saw anyone come to the same thing, right? The one clefs the person who did the seeing as opposed to saying by only that that's the person who did the seeing. So far, so good. But it was John who saw anyone is no good, where you expect it to be good. Compare the negation. It was John who didn't see anyone. Thumbs up, right? Second type of example. Both students who saw anything reported to the dean, no good. Both students who didn't see anything reported to the dean, thumbs up. But both students who saw blank is a downward entailing context. So both students who saw everything reported to the dean entails both students who saw everything that happened on a Tuesday report to the dean. So maybe that's okay. Maybe as long as it's not a sufficient property for licensing MPIs, as long as it's a necessary property, then we're okay. Because all von Fintel really needs is that it's a necessary property of licensing downward entailment items that the antecedent of conditionals do it, but I think that doesn't get things right either. Insofar as we think of counterfactuals as modals, which is an effect what von Fintel's pushing on us, it looks like you can get non-downward entailing contexts that do license MPIs. So there's H. The search committee can give the job to anyone. Can P is generally not downward entailing. So from the fact that you can climb a mountain doesn't follow that you can climb a mountain and kill a dragon, right? I can climb a mountain, I think, but I can't climb a mountain and kill a dragon. So it's not downward entailing, and yet anyone seems to be fine there. So looks like the best parts of von Fintel don't hold up. in fact, are subject to counterexample. And then there's things that look like they're unexplained by adopting the sort of machinery that he likes. So what's the overall kind of take-home message here? I hope there is one. I take it that there's sort of two. One, that it's worth looking into the sort of details of the analyses that get offered for these things. Because when you sort of squint at them, they look very, very similar. But actually, the philosophical bases on which they're both being provided give you a guide to how to start looking for what the relevant differences will be. And the predictions borne out help tell you not just which view to like, but also which philosophical basis might actually be vindicated, or at least partially vindicated, by how the details work out. And I've hoped I convinced you the details here don't work out for von Fintel in the way that the initial benefits that were claimed were promised to do. But the second one is the puzzle. And that's still sort of like, I still get puzzled by this. And again, I guess I shouldn't be, because it's not like just located with subjunctive conditionals. But like I said at the beginning, you should be able just to solve this puzzle without all the work I just did. You should be able to just look at number 2 of the classic RSS and think to yourself, forget someone asserting it to me, just imagine I think it to myself. What's wrong with 2? And then I should be able to myself to think, well, I'm in charge of this, right? This is my words, my sentences I'm putting forth to myself. What's wrong with 2? And if you're anything like me, you find yourself actually at kind of a loss to figure it out. And that should tell us something about what we're doing here, namely that even when you're in control of your intentions and they're kind of clear to you, or sorry, even when you're in control of your intentions because you're the one who gets to express what you want by 2, the mechanisms of language aren't nearly as clear to you as it would be nice if they were. And that's, to me, very puzzling and something I'd like to hear from you guys about. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Sure. I know that was puzzling, so I hope there are questions.
One clarificatory question about this downward.
Yeah.
Anyone? Because I was thinking examples. For example, like age.
Mm-hmm.
You say that there can be. It's not the case, right? That there are instructions on.
Yeah.
No, can, right? And with the other examples, like I don't know, if I saw anyone, I would have invited them home. If I saw anyone with a machine gun,
Yeah.
well, I wouldn't.
Good.
So seems like it depends on, I don't know.
Yeah. So this is a puzzle that people have worried about in the linguistics literature for the word any. So it gets called subtrigging sometimes. And the idea behind subtrigging is if you add a bunch of material, all of a sudden any sounds fine. So as you point out, I see any coins is no good, but I see any coins that come my way that have the queen's head on them sounds a lot better. I don't know why that is, but I should say that if it's true that adding material saves any, and that's really what's responsible, something about bare any is problematic, then it still is a kind of question, why is it okay under negation? And B, if negation's not really what's key to it, or downward entailing is what's key to it, then von Fintel loses one of the main arguments for the view. So it's a good question, what happens when I say anything that F, why things get better when you add a qualifier to any? You know, these are like, so it's not just your example, this is general, like, you know, I saw any student that had a good question, right? Fine. I saw any student no good. I don't know what it is. I wish I had a good account of this.
This don't
Yeah.
think of a discussion, which it likes to have wide scope if it can.
Yeah.
And the more material it's around, the more it's going to sort of get past in order to get wide scope. So you can more or less ignore it with smaller scope because of all the materials interfering somehow.
Yeah, but it's the somehow that's always really puzzling. It's like generally we don't think that more material prevents or encourages scoping,
so
right?
If you look at, even I have problems with my neighbour regrets that I bought a fender, first of all, if this is, the data's got to be, that's got to be any fender, right? Not a fender.
Well, it's supposed to be.
And then it's not,
Sorry.
it's not obviously grammatical then.
I thought the licensing was for a fender because it's downward entailing where the presuppositions are satisfied. So the presupposition is that I.
Right, but if you want to maintain the, yeah. But if you want to sort of really preserve the structure of it, you want to say there's more guitars than there are fenders, right? So you really want to test this with my neighbour regrets that I bought any fender, right? Rather than a fender.
What I'm trying to test is if it's downward entailing, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I present this slightly misleadingly, but take everyone is happy. That should entail Stephen is happy under the assumption that there's a Stephen in the discourse, right? Like on the presupposition that Stephen exists and is a person, right?
Yeah.
So you're able to test if it's downward entailing where the presuppositions are satisfied. And so the thought goes, my neighbor regrets that I bought any guitars won't entail that my neighbor regrets that I bought a Gibson if I didn't buy a Gibson. But if it's satisfied, then the same relationship should hold, right? I should be able to instantiate any thing that has a presupposition.
This seems to be a weakness of the Strawson test over the Laxo test.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. That's why I'm kind of worried about the using of Strawson downward entailment as a licensor for negative polarity. I think you're dead on. Which is a shame, because the history there is people are really puzzled, and they say it must be a negation that does it. And then wherever they saw any licensed, like anything being okay, they thought there must be a hidden negation there, right? Because I don't see anything, sounds good. I see anything, no good. So they said, wherever I see anything, there must be like a negation hanging about somewhere. If you look at Ludlow's work on logical form, he basically assumes this and tries to build it in, right? And then what you notice is, well, it doesn't look like that's right because it looks like you get failures anyways of downward entailment where the presuppositions aren't satisfied. So if I say, I regret buying any guitar, if I never bought a Gibson, I can't say I regret buying a Gibson because I regret buying a Gibson presupposes that I bought a Gibson. So then the thought goes, all right, so maybe it's really about presupposition satisfying, but what about the negation thing? And then people said, it's not negation, it's really downward entailing. Negation is just encoding a position that you can deduce downwardly from. And then people said, but what about conditionals, right? It looks like I could say if I see anything, I'll tell you, but there's no negation hanging around there unless you build it in kind of sneaky ways, which is what Ludlow tries to do. And then you think, well, if it's really downward entailment, you have to build a negation, but then it has to be downward entailing or Strawson downward entailing. And our claim is that doesn't hold up. So we still are on the search for what could be responsible for downward entailment. But if it's not Strawson downward entailment that does the licensing, then one of the main pillars for thinking that has to be sort of written into the conventions of the language, namely update the modal horizon by the antecedent, one of the best arguments of that view just fails. That's the idea. But this still leaves open a mystery. Why is I saw anything bad, but I saw anything that caught my eye okay? We can claim there's extra material license is something about scope, but that just pushes the mystery. Why would extra material licensing about scope? And moreover, it looks like it's unique to any. It looks like subtrading doesn't hold for all these other cases. I could say, idioms do well here, so sorry to swear, but I could say I don't give a shit, but I can't say I give a shit unless I put a lot of funny tone on it. Why? Well, it looks like idioms are licensed under negation, and you can put those in the antecedent conditionals. If you were to give a shit, I would do more for you. It looks like the data there is totally insensitive to adding more material. I'd say, I give a shit that you walked home and did this, or I give a shit on Tuesday, they're all bad. So there's a real mystery. From my instinct on this, I know this is slightly off topic, I think the categories of NPIs, of negative polarity items, is probably not a homogeneous category. I think there are probably very different things going on and there's a lot of work starting to be done to try to see those differences. My suspicion is that any is the worst one because it has so many funny features that are hard to explain. And so you shouldn't be using that to test views anyways, but that is the one that gets sort of brought out to test these sort of semanticized views where you explain polarity licensing by downward entailment and then say it has to be part of the logic that's downward entailment. Does that help? Sorry, that's a longer answer than. Yeah.
I have like a very basic question that looking at the part of salience and all of that, why is that if you say something like if Sophie were to the parade, you don't somehow implicate like another conditions that would impede her to see better happen?
Good. I mean, it's a tricky question to answer because I don't know the right answer is going to generalize very well to anything. The thought goes, if you accept number one, right? Let's say if I say number one, you accept that it's true, then by force we have to be looking at worlds that we're treating as normal where nothing funny happens. Because otherwise you wouldn't have accepted one. So imagine we go to a parade and let there's tall people everywhere. Like nobody can see anything. And I say, well, Sophie got on the parade, she would have seen Pedro. You should immediately be like, was she really tall? Or like, does she have stilts? Or like, can she climb on people's backs and be able to see? So the thought goes, well, you have to assume a fair bit about what count as the normal conditions. And like so Al Hayek has all these papers where he says that all these are false. Because, take even the most mundane, like if I drop this, it would fall down. He goes, well, if you learn some quantum mechanics, you'll know there's a very tiny chance it'll quantum tunnel upwards. And so you can't ignore that because science tells you it's a possibility. So it's a good question what licenses us to do that. But I think there's not much question that we do that, right? Because otherwise, we'd never treat these as true. And so the thought, I take it the cognitive psychology at some point will give a better answer to this, but it's going to be something like, we try to coordinate on like a topic of conversation. And if we don't sort of coordinate by eliminating the relevant worlds that we're taking to be kind of not normal, then we can't really get on to evaluate number one. So I basically put forth an offer like, hey, if Sophie got on the parade, she would have seen Pedro, and you start to work out, well, I guess he's thinking that there aren't very tall people, Sophie can see perfectly well, Pedro's going to be there in a visible spot, and not knowing any of those things to be true or think they're false will immediately give you reason to say, no, Pedro might not show up, or Pedro is usually the low person in the car, not the tall, highest person in the car. So I don't have a good general answer to give. I can gesture the mechanics, and the mechanics just encode it in the similarity relationship, but that doesn't tell you why it's similar. It's a good question. If you don't accept that, if you think we can't ignore those worlds, then you should never think that the data we started off with is any good. You should have thought number one's false. Maybe she gets stuck behind someone tall and call it a day, right? Sorry, I know that's not a helpful answer. It's a good question that everybody at some point has to face up to, no matter who they are, right? For von Fintel, the same question happens. Why is it when I take the modal horizon and then make it big enough to include a bunch of going to parade worlds, why don't those parade worlds contain, I think what Steve was asking before, why don't those already contain things where she's super short and can't see, or super tall, and so she can see past the tall people? And the thought goes, if we're not coordinated enough to get this going, we can't even get the puzzle going, because the puzzles want to contrast. So I guess I don't have a good answer for you other than to say, reject number one if you don't think we can do that. But if you think we can do that, the puzzle still is, why can't we reverse them? Does that make sense? Sorry, I wish I had a better thing to say. The Lewis answer could be this long story about how much of the world you have to change to make it happen, and what causal laws have to be more or less violated in more or less ways to make it happen. And so I guess the idea is something like, for a normal person like Sophie to go parade and not be able to move when there's someone tall around is pretty weird. You have to have her sort of paralyzed and unable to go around tall people. So the thought goes, those are kind of weird worlds that we don't really consider much because we know how the causal transactions tend to go. But the best I could do is gesture at that. Sorry. More questions? Stephen, did you have one?
No.
I have one more related to the counterexample one. That is more because when you say that so if Sophie had gone to the parade, she might have had her eyes cursed by Gandalf.
Yeah.
For me, it wasn't that striking because I think that a parade is a place where you can see a Gandalf.
Where you can see.
You can meet someone dressed as a Gandalf. So
Right.
I expect that you are rational. I am rational. We are talking about Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
We are talking about the parade, and you suddenly told me. So if Sophie had gone to the parade, she might have her eyes cursed by Gandalf.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like, it makes sense.
I mean, it's not just you can see.
I could imagine that in a natural conversation with a friend, because we know that in that parade there is a chance of people being dressed as Gandalf. So maybe that I am misled because parade for me doesn't. I have no intuitions in English.
But it's not just that you'll see
What
someone
parade means.
dressed like Gandalf. They also have to be able to curse your eyes.
Making as if it was cursing people. I mean, it's a parade, no? I was thinking that maybe for other people, the example with telling parade and putting there a fictional character, it might not become so intuitive. The idea that the second sentence in the counterexample is missing something. I don't know if I explain myself.
No, I understand. I mean, I'm always not just that there's like a fictional character, but like that he does things that you know are impossible, like cursing people's eyes that they can't see. But yeah, the more you can interpret metaphorically, the easier it is to rescue this. But if you like, if praise is throwing you off.
With a friend,
Yeah.
so I can imagine that in Carnival, yesterday day was Carnival, I am talking with a friend, and I said, I met Superman trying to save a pigeon or whatever.
Yeah, but say you say, I met Superman flying in the air, and
No,
because that's kind of what's going on
yeah,
here.
okay. Maybe it's because
I mean,
immediately.
if it's parade that's throwing you off, we can, we can test this with non-parade context. Like, if Sophie had come to my house and had her eyes seen, cursed by Gandalf, she wouldn't see me.
Because I am not expecting someone dressed as Gandalf in your house. I hope.
Yeah, but if she did.
Come on, the interpretation one is false.
What?
Under his interpretation, in which someone is costumed as
Yeah.
Gandalf, one is false.
Yeah, I mean, even if you like did this and like try to make her blind, she'd still see Pedro, right? Because you can't actually make someone blind. By.
Because that doesn't work, actually.
That's to be the real Gandalf.
Yeah.
Who's capable of cursing people.
I was imagining a contest where there is a lot of people, some guy approached to you, making as if it was making a curse, and because you get distracted, you look to the place where there is Pedro.
Okay.
A real situation. I am imagining a real situation where
I
this
see.
sentence can make sense. Obviously.
Gotcha.
Because in a parade, strange people do strange things. That's why I was thinking, no, maybe a parade is...
Well, I'll tell you what. What's the strangest thing you can imagine that you can't do at a parade? And then throw that in here. And whatever it is, then try and like see number two.
That intuitive. The idea of, because of the parade.
Fair enough.
It was,
I'm happy to change parade. I'm happy to throw in for getting your eyes cursed by someone. Whatever you think can't be done, whatever we replace parades with. But I take your point that like, once you start talking about fiction, and then once you start thinking about what you want to say relative to the fiction, it gets a lot harder to divest yourself from the fictional suggestions.
and I was
So.
imagining a natural conversation in this context.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't think there's anything essential to the context that involves
No.
Gandalf or Lord of the Rings, but yeah, thanks. I appreciate the. I mean, I think it's not good to have a test case where you encourage readings that aren't, like starkly literal, and focusing on fiction is definitely a case where you'll encourage people not to read things as starkly literal. So, fair point. But like, if you're thinking literally, you get the context right. I mean, maybe you think there's a Gandalf who can curse people, in which case, this will seem very different to you, right? Like, if you really believe there's a guy Gandalf, these examples will not move you at all. You're like, watch out, don't go to parades. Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
Well, just a very minor
Yeah.
question of the example too.
Yeah.
Being stuck behind a tall person, I mean, I understood that Sophie was not as tall as the tall person, right?
Yeah.
Or taller. But I wonder whether that's literal or just also like
Yeah.
an implicature, right? Can a tall, very tall person be stuck behind a person with tall and not as tall as her?
Yeah. I mean,
Depends on.
these are really good questions. I just want to flag, like, they're questions for like any view that wants to explain counterfactuals. Because, I mean, the question's always been something like, if all I tell you is P were Q, right? P had been then Q would have been. Like many cases where I look what I put forth as a universal quantifier over possibilities, it's going to be restricted typically, right? And like, you can think of the endless numbers, like if I say, I promise to pick you up tomorrow, right? Well, if I die, I don't violate my promise, and if you kill my family and I don't pick you up, the promise is like canceled. There's a fair bit of like leeway for like, if you think of this roughly as all the P worlds are Q worlds, there's always going to be some leeway for what counts as a relevant P world. And so, one literally minded view is something like, well, it's all of them. So these are never true, because for any given P world, unless this is like necessarily follows from P or as necessary truth, you're going to get some strange world where it doesn't happen. And so the idea is, if you're modeling truth conditions and don't want to have all that much by way to say of like how we actually discuss using them, you think there could be a stark divide. The way that people think, like if I say every student failed, I thereby say but don't implicate that every student in the world failed, then this won't have much purchase for you because you'll think they're all just false, right? And then the real question is, why do we get away with saying 1 and 2 and then not 1 and 2, given that they're all false anyways, right? But given that, like, we're answering partly the master question by thinking of things like, how are we actually using these to get across things that we expect our audience to be able to recover? The thought goes, we have some background coordination over like how to think of the restrictions on the worlds. Now, how that gets done, every theory has a problem with. So Goodman had this problem of cotenability. How do you fill out like all the relevant sentences to get the relevant entailment? Lewis had the problem of similarity. People who like premise semantics have the problem of like figuring out what premises are being held as background. And there's nothing that's given to you as obvious just by the bare assertion of P, right? So these are all great questions that no one has, I think, an obvious answer to. You get two types of answers. One, think of like constraints on how the world actually is that are going to give you P. So Lewis tries to do this in this very methodical way that leads into trouble in like these dependence cases. But he's like, make the world only different one slight spot, but then make everything else really different given that the causal laws are still operating. Another one is make it so that we have some sort of agreement over what we're paying attention to and what we're not. And they're going to give you very different predictions for.
Another way of, formally you would say that you study with this and that the moral horizon was, so to speak, empty, right?
Yeah.
So usually in everyday communication, there is some names or items. So initially, in your example, there was no assumption about Anne's or Sophie's tallness, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And that's introduced by the second.
Well, so I guess I was hoping that you'd accommodate that Sophie's not super tall, right?
Yeah.
But one of the ways to test for this is, like if I say number 1, and you don't say, what if she's super tall? Then you're implicitly accepting that she's not like able to stand on stilts, et cetera, right? Now, how do we encode that is a tricky question, I think. Steve?
I'm just curious why you're using counterfactuals, why you use counterfactuals to do this, because this is a phenomenon that you can talk about straightforwardly without invoking counterfactuals. I mean, so Sophie says, if I go to the parade, I'll see Pedro.
Mm-hmm.
But if I go to the parade and I'm stuck behind a tall person, I won't. And then, of course, you can. So it's rather like the whole Tetris Paradise law situation, right? Because you can say, somebody can say, well, you won't if you get stuck behind a tall person. And say, and she says, unless I take my stilts. And then the other person says, well, unless somebody's sort of gap in your stilts so that they fall off so you fall off. And she said, but unless I glue it back together.
Yeah.
Anyway, it just goes on and on. So there's, you're inevitably going to be able to ping pong backwards and forwards like this, right? So I don't see why, given the sort of ceteris paribus literature doesn't require you to invoke counterfactuals to do this. Why is this all couched in terms of counterfactuals? And there's enough issues to do with worlds that we're just talking about indicative conditionals.
Yeah.
It seems to just get in the way of it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I can tell you why I did it this way, but like for the stock. But I mean, one thought was I wanted to contrast two approaches, and I just don't find the modal horizon type picture like very easily recreatable in the indicative case. So I'm not sure like you actually have the two competitors stated in the way that I'm looking for. But I agree, the phenomenon is very similar, right?
But isn't the modal horizon, doesn't that just translate into how far we're prepared to extend into the actual world? How much information about the actual world we're prepared to bring in?
Yeah, with indicatives, I thought the usual key is things that are obviously ruled out by the real world make antecedents false, and then you have this tricky question about indicative conditionals. When do we and when don't we accept discussions that involve known false antecedents? Which makes it hard to know like how to apply these, because until you have a good view of that, you have no good view about how to make the middle horizon react to it. But I agree with you with the basic idea that like the phenomenon doesn't seem at all like special to counterfactuals, right? Like that phenomenon gets its purchase like all over the place. So like Moss thought the knowledge literature is one where you get this phenomenon going, right? Where you say, I know I'm in San Sebastian. I'm like, how do you know you're not asleep and dreaming? And you're like, I know I'm in San Sebastian. You're like, well, how do you know? And then the complaint is something like, you should be asserting it because you're not forgetting knowledge and just don't have enough evidence to rule out something I've made salient. In the indicative case, I agree. So one of the arguments that I wanted to put in that my co-writer didn't was, this doesn't handle the indicative case very well. In the indicative case, you can resurrect exactly the same puzzle. And then we got tied up trying to think if you could extend the modal horizon idea cleanly to the indicative case because of these known false antecedents. That's the idea. So for me, like the bigger question that sounds like a throwaway, but I really mean it is, there's something kind of puzzling about how, you can get sort of like indirect confirmation for two very different philosophical motivations by looking at these details. And so I needed two views that are well articulated enough to compare the details with different motivations. And B, I really am sort of curious, like, why is it you can't just think about number two? Or in the indicative case, think about the indicative case and be like, yeah, if I go to the parade, I could think about it in the past if I forgot. If I went to the parade yesterday, I saw Pedro. And someone says, well, if you went to the parade yesterday, you got stuck behind someone tall, you didn't see Pedro. And I think, yeah. How come I'm no longer certain that if I went to the parade, I didn't see Pedro, right?
Oh, I got stilts.
Yeah, maybe I had stilts, that's right. You see them in the closet or something. So yeah, but they're broken. I say, yeah, but I bought glue yesterday. Yeah, it's an excellent point that it's nothing special about subjunctives here. I like that I had two views that are like well enough made out to give you predictions and don't suffer from corresponding, I think, problems for the indicatives to worry about, but I think it's a real question. And I think one view that could get both would obviously do better. I think that gives the advantage to Moss, because I think that general type of explanation where all of a sudden the indicative case you feel like you just can't rule out something that you need to rule out looks like it governs something like the indicative case, but I think that's for further research on.
There's this sort of epistemic situation with something like the modal horizon, but an epistemic nature. You've got to kick in on your reasons for wanting to assert a condition.
Yeah, I think that's
information you're prepared to bring to bear, how much you're certain of.
Yeah, it's like if you've never bought stilts before, right? Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that's an excellent place to look next. Other questions? These have all been really helpful. So the more the merrier for me. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.